Everyone feared the millionaire. Until the Jewish waitress silenced him in front of everyone. "Hey, you stinking Jew, get me another drink and don't touch the glass with your dirty hands." Richard Steinberg's voice echoed through the elegant Maison d'Or restaurant like a whip, causing customers at nearby tables to stop talking and lower their eyes, pretending not to have heard. Sarah Goldberg, 28, gripped her tray tighter and took a deep breath. In 3 years of waiting tables in that place, she had developed an almost supernatural resistance to that man's insults. What the others didn't know was that every venomous word he spat was being carefully catalogued in her mind, like pieces of a puzzle she had been putting together for a long time. "Of course, Mr. Steinberg," she replied with a calmness that made some of the staff look surprised. There was no tremor in her voice, no tears in her eyes. Just a strange serenity, as if she knew something no one else did. Richard Steinberg III was the kind of millionaire who bought restaurants just for the pleasure of humiliating the people who worked in them. At 52, heir to a fortune ironically built by his Jewish grandfather, he had spent his entire life trying to distance himself from his own origins through hatred. It was as if he believed that the more cruelty he directed at other Jews, the more pure American he would become. The Maison d'Or wasn't just a restaurant, it was his private playground of sadism. He had bought the establishment 2 years earlier, not for the profit, but for the absolute power he wielded over every employee. The whole team knew that one word from him could mean immediate dismissal, and he loved this dynamic of silent terror he had created. "Did you hear what I said about your hands?" he bellowed, slamming his fist on the Italian marble table. "People like you carry diseases. That's why the world has always wanted to get rid of you." The restaurant fell deathly silent. Margaret, the 45-year-old manager, pretended to be busy with paperwork, but her hands were visibly shaking. James, the sommelier, looked away and concentrated intently on a bottle of wine that needed no attention. Even other millionaire clients, used to Steinberg's excesses, seemed uncomfortable with this public display of anti-Semitism. Sarah had learned a long time ago that reacting only fed his thirst for power. But in the last 6 months, something had changed in her strategy. Instead of simply putting up with it, she began to observe, study, and document. Every insult, every threat, every public display of hatred was being meticulously noted down in a small notebook she kept in the locker room. "Sarah, you don't have to put up with this," Michael, the barman, whispered as she approached the bar to get her drink. "It's the 3rd time this week he's come here just to torment you." "I know, Mike," she replied quietly, but there was something in her tone that made the barman frown. "He doesn't know, but he's giving me exactly what I need." Michael had known her for 3 years and had never seen that expression on her face. It wasn't resignation, it wasn't fear. It was the calculated calm of someone who was playing a much more complex game than it appeared. Over the last 6 months, Sarah had noticed a pattern in Steinberg's attacks. He always came on Wednesdays, always asked for table 12, always made a point of being seen by her. He always repeated the same insults, the same veiled threats, as if following a sick script. What he didn't realize was that his every performance was being watched not just by her, but by someone very specific. When he returned with a drink, a 30-year-old whiskey that cost more than his monthly salary, Steinberg stared at her with that disgusting smile he reserved for moments of maximum cruelty. "Do you know what I did earlier today, little Jew? I fired 5 people from my company. Do you want to know why?" Sarah placed her glass on the table without saying anything, but her eyes quickly met those of a man in a gray suit sitting alone at table 8. He gave an almost imperceptible nod, 2 fingers discreetly touching the side of the coffee cup. It was the confirmation she had been waiting for weeks. The man at table 8 was David Cohen, a private investigator specializing in hate crimes, who had been discreetly hired by an organization that Sarah preferred to keep secret for the time being. He had been frequenting the restaurant for 2 months documenting Steinberg's systematic attacks, but today was going to be special. "Because I discovered that they had blood just like yours running through their veins," Steinberg continued, thinking that his captive audience of terrified employees was a sign of victory. "My company is no place for parasites. Steinberg Industries is a traditional American company, not a haven for scraps." Every word was carefully chosen to cause maximum psychological damage. Sarah knew he wasn't just being cruel, he was being strategically cruel, testing how far he could go before anyone had the courage to confront him. The problem was that he had chosen the wrong person for this experiment. Sarah had 2 degrees, one in psychology and the other in labor law, but she worked as a waitress for a very specific reason that no one in the restaurant knew about. Every humiliation she absorbed, Every insult she documented, every witness who observed her reactions was being carefully prepared for a moment that was fast approaching. "Anything else, Mr. Steinberg?" she asked in that professionally neutral voice she had learned to use. "Yes," he replied, picking up his cell phone and typing something. "I want everyone here to know that I'm recording you. Any complaints about my behavior go straight to my company's legal department. Do you know how much it costs to sue people like you into bankruptcy?" There, as that powerful man poured his venom all over the restaurant, something began to take shape in Sarah's eyes. It wasn't fear, it wasn't resignation. It was the dangerous calm of someone who is about to play the card they have held for a long time. While everyone around her trembled in the face of Steinberg's anti-Semitic fury, she maintained that disturbing serenity of someone who knows that the show is just beginning. What Steinberg didn't realize was that his own arrogance was about to become the most powerful weapon against him. If you're following this story of courage and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what's about to happen will show that some people confuse silence with weakness, and this confusion can cost a lot more than they realize. 3 weeks before that devastating confrontation at the Maison d'Or, Sarah had made a decision that would change everything. Sitting in a small apartment she shared with 2 roommates, she typed furiously on her laptop, documenting every insult, every threat, every moment of psychological terror that Steinberg had inflicted over the last few months. "Sarah, are you sure about this?" asked David Cohen during a discreet meeting in a cafe 8 blocks from the restaurant. The private investigator had been hired by the Anti-Defamation League after Sarah made a formal complaint, but the case had become personal for both of them when they discovered something disturbing about Steinberg's past. "He's not just a rich man being cruel," Sarah explained, showing the meticulous notes she had collected. "There's a pattern. He systematically fires Jewish employees, denies them promotions, creates hostile environments. This is organized persecution." David flipped through the documents Sarah had prepared, screenshots of internal Steinberg Industries emails, audio recordings made discreetly during the restaurant attacks, witnesses from other establishments where Steinberg had caused similar incidents. It was an impressive dossier for someone who was supposedly just a waitress. What David didn't yet know was that Sarah Goldberg was no ordinary victim. With a degree in psychology from Columbia University and a master's in employment law from NYU, she had chosen to work in services to study workplace discrimination from the inside out. Her master's thesis, Microaggressions and Psychological Terror in Corporate Environments, was about to become a real case of devastating proportions. "There's one more thing," Sarah said, hesitating for a moment. "I found out that his company has million-dollar contracts with government agencies. If we can prove systematic discrimination, it won't just be a labor issue, it'll be a federal scandal." Meanwhile, Steinberg intensified his attacks as if he sensed that something was changing. In the week following his meeting with David, he showed up at the restaurant 3 times, each visit more vicious than the last. On Tuesday, he had forced Sarah to redo her order 5 times, claiming that people like her didn't know how to follow simple instructions. On Thursday, it was even worse. Steinberg brought in 2 business partners and used Sarah as a living example of why certain groups never thrive in America. Margaret, the manager, watched in horror, but didn't dare intervene. Steinberg had made it clear that any employee who confronted him would be fired immediately and sued for defamation. "Look at her," he said to the partners, pointing at Sarah as she cleared a nearby table. "University education probably, but still unsuitable for jobs that require real competence. It's cultural, you know? They'd rather be victims than productive." Sarah kept her composure, but something boiled up inside her. It wasn't just anger, it was the cold determination of someone who had found her purpose. Every venomous word Steinberg spat was being recorded by a microscopic device David had provided, hidden in his uniform apron. The attacks began to affect other employees too. Michael, the bartender, had resigned the week before after Steinberg publicly humiliated him for serving drinks that tasted like a concentration camp. James, the sommelier, developed a nervous stutter that only appeared when Steinberg was present. But the most revealing moment came when Sarah discovered the true extent of Steinberg's hypocrisy. During a telephone conversation he made in the restaurant, thinking no one was paying attention, she heard something that froze her blood. "Yes, Dad's fine. No, I didn't tell anyone about the family's original surname," he whispered into the phone, clearly talking to someone intimate. "Steinman worked very well for business. Nobody suspects that we're, you know." Sarah almost dropped the tray she was carrying. Richard Steinberg, the most vicious anti-Semite she had ever met, was himself Jewish. His hatred wasn't just prejudice, it was a perverse form of self-pulse turned into a weapon against others of the same origin. That night, she called David, her voice shaking with indignation. "I've discovered something that changes everything. He's not just an ordinary anti-Semite, he's a Jew who hates his own identity and projects that hatred onto others." "That would explain the intensity of the attacks," David replied. "People who deny their own origins often become the most vicious persecutors of their former groups." Sarah knew she had in her hands something much more powerful than a simple case of discrimination at work. She held the key to exposing not just one cruel man, but an entire system of hatred and hypocrisy that extended far beyond the Maison d'Or. The preparation for the final confrontation began at that moment. Sarah was no longer just an employee being persecuted, she had become an investigator with a mission. And Steinberg, in his blind arrogance, continued to provide evidence against himself, having no idea that every cruel word was being carefully documented by someone far more intelligent and prepared than he could ever have imagined. Each new humiliation only strengthened something inside her that her oppressors couldn't see, a silent force being fed by the very injustice they were trying to impose. What this privileged man didn't know was that each act of contempt was writing its own sentence of defeat, and that he would soon discover that he had chosen the absolute wrong person to turn into a victim. Sarah's real transformation began on a Monday morning, when she arrived at work 2 hours early. David Cohen was waiting in the parking lot with a black briefcase and an expression that mixed expectation with concern. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked, handing her a set of microscopic recording equipment. "Once we start systematically documenting, there's no going back. Steinberg will realize that something has changed." "He's already noticed," Sarah replied, examining the small device that disguised itself perfectly as an apron button. "Yesterday he followed me into the parking lot and said that I was different. He said that employees like me need constant reminding of their place." What Steinberg didn't know was that this conversation had also been recorded. Sarah had developed the habit of always keeping her cell phone recording when she was at work, a precaution that would prove devastating to her bullying plans. Over the next 2 weeks, Steinberg stepped up his attacks like a predator sensing that its prey was about to escape. He started showing up at the restaurant outside of his usual hours, always inventing new forms of public humiliation. On Tuesday, he forced Sarah to redo the same order 7 times, claiming that she obviously didn't understand English properly because of the inferior education of her race. On Thursday, he went even further. He brought his wife, Victoria Steinberg, a socialite who clearly felt uncomfortable with her husband's behavior, but didn't have the courage to confront him. Over dinner, he used Sarah as a living example of why certain ethnicities can never thrive in modern America. "Look at her, honey," he said to his wife as Sarah poured the wine, speaking as if she wasn't there. "University education probably, but still unsuitable for positions that require real leadership. It's genetic, you see. They're naturally submissive." Victoria looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed shame and silent apology. It was obvious that witnessing these attacks caused the woman genuine discomfort, but she remained silent, a prisoner of her own privilege and financial dependence. What neither of them realized was that every word was being meticulously documented not only by Sarah's devices, but by a growing network of allies that David had mobilized. The Anti-Defamation League had classified the case as a priority, especially after they discovered Steinberg Industries' government connections. "Sarah," David said during a secret meeting later that week, "we've got something big." A former employee of his company offered to testify. Apparently, Steinberg has systematically fired 12 Jewish employees in the last 2 years, always making up legal excuses, but the patterns are undeniable. Rebecca Martinez, the former human resources director at Steinberg Industries, had been the first to connect the dots. Fired after discreetly questioning the company's discriminatory practices, she kept copies of all the internal memos documenting Steinberg's instructions to keep the company culturally cohesive. "He never explicitly said not to hire Jews," Rebecca explained during the taped deposition. "But he always asked to check applicants' family backgrounds and systematically rejected those with names that didn't sound American enough." As the evidence piled up, Sarah maintained her performance as a submissive employee at the restaurant. But with each passing day, her confidence grew. She had discovered something that would change everything: the recordings of Steinberg's private phone conversations, where he admitted his own Jewish origin to family members. "Dad always said never to reveal our past," he had whispered into the phone the week before, thinking he was alone in the restaurant bathroom. "Steinman wouldn't work for business. Real Americans wouldn't trust someone with that last name. The hypocrisy was so profound that it was tragicomic. Richard Steinberg had spent decades building a fortune based on American government contracts, while hiding his own origins and persecuting others of the same heritage he denied. Sarah kept this recording as the centerpiece of her strategy. It wasn't just proof of discrimination, it was evidence of a perverse form of self-hatred that manifested itself through the systematic persecution of other Jews. The public revelation of this truth would not only destroy Steinberg's reputation, it would expose the sick nature of his entire belief system. The preparation for the final confrontation was almost complete. Sarah had collected more than 40 hours of recordings, dozens of testimonies, internal company documents, and evidence of discrimination that extended far beyond the restaurant. Every insult she absorbed, every humiliation she documented, was being turned into ammunition for a battle that Steinberg didn't even know he was about to face. Margaret, the manager, began to notice subtle changes in Sarah's behavior. "You seem different," she commented one afternoon. "More confident. Not that that's a bad thing, it's just that after everything that man did." "Sometimes people confuse patience with weakness," Sarah replied, meticulously organizing the tables. "But anyone who really understands strategy knows that the best revenge is always served at just the right moment, when the target is completely off guard." What everyone at Maison d'Or was about to discover was that Sarah Goldberg wasn't just a brave waitress facing a powerful man. She was a highly skilled strategist who had turned months of systematic abuse into the foundation of a federal case that would redefine how workplace discrimination was treated in American courts. And Steinberg, in his blind arrogance, kept providing evidence against himself, completely unaware that every cruel word was being carefully filed by someone far more intelligent and prepared than he could ever suspect. The moment of truth arrived on a Thursday, at exactly 7:30 in the evening, the busiest time at the Maison d'Or. Steinberg had arrived with his usual group of Millionaire associates, expecting another night of sadistic entertainment at Sarah's expense. What he didn't know was that every single person in the restaurant that night was there for a very specific reason. "Jewish waitress," he shouted as soon as he entered, "bring drinks for real men." The insult echoed through the restaurant, but this time something was different. Instead of the usual embarrassed silence, murmurs began to spread around the tables. Sarah approached calmly, carrying not just a tray, but a discreetly positioned tablet. "Of course, Mr. Steinberg. But first, I'd like to share something interesting I've discovered about your family background." "What the hell are you talking about?" Steinberg growled, but there was something in Sarah's confident tone that made a twinge of nervousness cross her face. "I've discovered that sometimes people change their surnames to sound more American," Sarah said, tapping the tablet screen. "For example, when a Steinman family decides to become Steinberg." The blood froze in Richard's veins. His eyes widened in pure panic when he realized what was happening. "You don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, but his voice had lost all authority. "Actually, I know exactly what I'm talking about," Sarah replied, and the tablet projected a crystal-clear audio recording onto the wall. Steinberg's unmistakable voice echoed through the restaurant. "Dad always said never to reveal our past. Steinman wouldn't work for business. Real Americans wouldn't trust someone with that last name." The silence that followed was absolute. Customers stopped eating. Waiters stopped serving. Even Steinberg's partners looked at him with a mixture of shock and disgust. The man who had spent years persecuting Jews had just been exposed as a Jew himself. "This is a forgery," Steinberg shouted, but his voice sounded desperate. "You manipulated that recording." "Manipulated it?" Sarah smiled for the first time in 3 years. "Like the original birth certificate I got?" Richard Steinman, born in Brooklyn, son of Abraham and Ruth Steinman, both Jewish immigrants from Poland. David Cohen stood up from table 8, showing his ID. "Richard Steinberg, I'm investigator David Cohen of the Anti-Defamation League. We've been documenting your discriminatory activities for 6 months." The restaurant erupted in murmurs. Steinberg looked around desperately, realizing that at least half of the customers present were actually strategically placed journalists, investigators, and witnesses. "In addition to the recordings of your anti-Semitic confessions," Sarah continued, "we have complete documentation of systematic discrimination at Steinberg Industries. 12 employees fired for the same reasons you used to attack me." Rebecca Martinez stood up from a nearby table. "Mr. Steinberg, I'm Rebecca Martinez, your former HR director. I've brought copies of all the memos where you instructed the company to maintain cultural cohesion by rejecting candidates with non-American names. Steinberg was pale, in a cold sweat, looking around like a cornered animal. You can't do this to me. I have government contracts. I have influence. I will destroy you all. About the government contracts, Sarah said, picking up another document, the Justice Department has already been notified. Systematic discrimination is incompatible with federal contracts. Your company lost $340 million in contracts this afternoon. The figure hit Steinberg like a punch in the gut. $340 million, he whispered, his legs wobbly. And that's just the beginning, David added. We have class action lawsuits being prepared by all the employees you persecuted, plus a federal criminal investigation for hate crimes. Victoria Steinberg, who had been watching everything in silence, slowly stood up. Richard, she said in a voice that cut through the air like ice, you told me that these people were different from us. That they deserved to be treated like that. But you are. She couldn't finish the sentence. Victoria, wait, Steinberg begged, but she was already leaving the restaurant, taking off her wedding ring and dropping it on the floor. Margaret, the manager, finally found the courage to speak. Mr. Steinberg, as the owner of this restaurant, you are officially banned from entering here again. I am the owner, he shouted. You were, David corrected. Your properties are being frozen for investigation. The restaurant is being transferred to a fund run by victims of discrimination. Steinberg looked at Sarah with a hatred that mixed total despair. You planned all this. You deceived me. I documented all of this, Sarah corrected. Every insult, every threat, every moment when you chose to express hatred against your own heritage through other people. The only person who has wronged anyone here is yourself. Steinberg's cell phone started ringing incessantly. Partners canceling contracts, lawyers demanding emergency meetings, the media wanting statements. In a matter of minutes, his life had completely fallen apart. 3 years, Sarah said as he staggered towards the door. 3 years you came here to humiliate me, not knowing you were talking to someone who has a master's degree in labor law and psychology. Someone who turned each of your attacks into the foundation of the federal case that just destroyed your life. Steinberg stopped at the door, turning around one last time. Why? He asked, his voice broken. Why did you do it? Because, Sarah replied with a dignity that contrasted brutally with his pathetic state. Someone needed to show that hatred of yourself projected onto others isn't power, it's the most pathetic form of weakness. As the revelations piled up and the masks fell away, a question remained in the air. Was it possible that a man who had spent decades denying his own identity could find redemption, or are some chasms of self-hatred too deep to cross? 6 months after Richard Steinberg's public collapse, the transformation was complete and devastating. The man who once terrorized restaurant workers was now living in a one-bedroom apartment in Queens, supported by a part-time job at a used bookstore, ironically, the only company that agreed to hire him after the scandal. Steinberg Industries had gone completely bankrupt. The cancelled government contracts created a domino effect that brought down the entire company. 500 employees lost their jobs, but Sarah ensured that each of the 12 wrongfully dismissed Jewish employees received substantial compensation from Steinberg's frozen personal assets. It's ironic, David Cohen commented during the official inauguration of the Second Chance Foundation, that a man obsessed with hiding his Jewish identity ended up creating one of the greatest Jewish workers' rights organizations in history. Sarah, now executive director of the foundation funded with the remains of Steinberg's fortune, had become a nationally recognized figure. Her case was studied at law universities, documented in books on employment discrimination, and turned into federal legal precedent. Harvard and Columbia vied to offer her visiting professorships. The Maison d'Or, under new management, implemented the Dignity at Work Protocol, a set of policies created by Sarah that became a model for restaurants across the country. Margaret, promoted to regional manager, often told new employees the story of the waitress who turned years of abuse into systemic change. Miss Goldberg, said a young journalist during a recent interview, many people believe that your revenge was excessive. Steinberg lost everything: fortune, family, social status. Don't you feel sorry for him? Sarah reflected carefully before answering. I feel sorry for the Jewish boy who grew up hating his own identity. But the adult Richard Steinberg made conscious choices for decades. He chose to turn his self-hatred into a weapon against innocent people. The consequences didn't come from me, they came from his own actions finally being exposed. The revelation that Steinberg was Jewish had created shockwaves far beyond the legal case. Jewish communities across the country began painful but necessary conversations about identity, assimilation, and internalized self-hatred. Psychologists began to study the phenomenon of self-preservation anti-Semitism as an extreme form of generational trauma. Rabbis from different denominations invited Sarah to lecture on how to recognize and combat self-hatred within their own communities. The Steinberg case showed us that the most dangerous anti-Semitism sometimes comes from within, she said during a conference at Yeshiva University. When we deny our identity to gain acceptance, we don't become safer, we become complicit in our own persecution. Victoria Steinberg, who started divorce proceedings the day after the scandal, made a public statement weeks later. I lived 15 years married to a man who not only lied about who he was, but destroyed other people to maintain that lie. Sarah Goldberg didn't ruin my marriage, she freed me from an illusion. Victoria had moved to the West Coast, where she began volunteering for organizations that support women who have been victims of psychological abuse. In later interviews, she described how she had normalized her ex-husband's cruel behavior, thinking it was just a powerful man being demanding. Steinberg himself never spoke publicly about the case. Neighbors reported seeing him walking alone on the streets of Queens, apparently lost in thought. An employee at the bookstore where he worked said that he spent weeks only in the Jewish history section, reading about the Holocaust and Jewish immigration to America. The most tragic part, Sarah reflected during her speech on the Foundation's first anniversary, is that if Richard had channeled his intelligence and resources into fighting anti-Semitism instead of perpetuating it, he could have been a powerful leader in the fight for justice. Instead, he chose to become exactly what his grandparents fled in Europe. The Second Chance Foundation had already helped more than 1,000 employees who were victims of discrimination, sued dozens of companies for illegal practices, and changed labor laws in 6 states. Sarah had turned her personal experience of abuse into a national movement that saved lives and careers on a daily basis. Michael, the former bartender at Maison d'Or, now runs 3 restaurants of his own, all following the dignity at work protocols created by Sarah. She taught us that we don't have to accept abuse to keep our jobs, he said during a meeting of the Restaurant Association. Dignity is not a luxury, it's a basic right. The Second Chance Foundation's official social network had more than 2 million followers, sharing daily stories of employees who found the courage to report abuse after learning about Sarah's case. Hashtags like #DignityAtWork and #WithoutHate have become global movements. One recent afternoon, while reviewing proposals for the Foundation's expansion into Canada and the UK, Sarah received a letter with no sender. Inside, a single handwritten line, "Thank you for showing me who I really am, even if it was too late." She never knew if the letter was from Steinberg, but she kept it as a reminder that even in the most extreme cases of hatred and hypocrisy, there is always a spark of humanity waiting to be rediscovered. The letter was framed in her office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that true victory is not in destroying enemies, but in planting seeds of change. Sarah Goldberg's story proved that the best revenge is not to destroy the enemy, it is to turn the injustice suffered into a tool to protect others who have yet to find their voice. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't making someone pay for what they've done, but making sure they can never do it to anyone again. She had learned that true power doesn't come from hiding who you are, but from embracing your identity completely and using it to build a world where no one has to choose between success and authenticity. Every insult she absorbed, every humiliation she documented, had become a brick in the construction of something greater than any personal vendetta. If this story of courage, justice, and transformation has touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that show how one determined person can change the world, one injustice at a time, proving that true victory is not making others pay for what they have done, but building something so great that their attempts to diminish us become irrelevant.